As World War I came to an end, the new leadership introduced various bills to limit the build-up of military forces and armament in hopes of preventing another world war. Congress would pass the first cruiser bill in 1924 that restricted the construction to only 8 American cruisers. These were called the Pensacola-class cruisers because that was the name of the first one. She was followed by the Salt Lake City, Augusta, Chester, Houston, Louisville, Northampton, and the Chicago. The Norfolk Navy laid her keel on October 27, 1026, and was finally launched on April 25, 1929. By Navy tradition, all launched ships had to have a christening ceremony that dates back hundreds of years. It is a maritime legacy that requires a blessing to provide for the protection of the ship and its crew, and must be done before it sails. Seafarers by nature have always been a very superstitious group, and they believe ships are possessed by spirits that have their own idiosyncrasies. Other words, with no blessing you would be subjected to bad winds, storms, leaking hulls, reefs, scurvy, and all other forms of ill luck. They even believed that if a ship was not properly named and blessed, it would not be able to navigate the seas safely. As time went on, it became a necessary ritual. When it came time to finally launching the USS Pensacola, they wanted to select someone from the ship's namesake. But it had to be the right female sponsor, also called a godmother, for the christening ritual. The ritual called for a bottle of spirits to be broken on the bow to allow the ship to sink into the water. A bottle that did not break on the first try was considered a very bad omen. So you can see that you had to pick the right person to handle the weight of this huge responsibility. So, the person selected was none other than Josie Knowles, the daughter of William Hyer Knowles and Mary Daves Ellis. The Knowles family dated back to our territorial period with the arrival of Peter Knowles, who married Josephine Hyer in 1822. Together, the two influential families began to build a financial empire. Their 2 grandsons William and Peter alone would greatly increase the family's financial influence in Northwest Florida. William would become one of the kings of commerce in Pensacola, as he became president of banks, insurance companies, lending institutions among many more. In 1885, he had married Mary Davis Ellis, the daughter of John Ellis, who had been the governor of North Carolina in 1861, and Mary McKinley Daves. So, as you can see, her father was a very wealthy and influential figure in the community. But not only did he have financial connections, he also had military ones as well. First of all, Pensacola is a Navy town with a long history with the military. In fact, he had even entertained the Secretary of the Navy and future President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his home on one of his visits to our Gulf Coast town. Josie had married Joseph Lionel Selgiman Sr. in June of 1911 in North Hatley, Quebec. He was the son of a Manhattan banker, Isaac Newton Seligman and Guta Lib. Joseph left his banking position when he was called up by the U.S. Army on June 17, 1917, as a first lieutenant in an ordnance unit during World War I. He was sent overseas in May 1918 and discharged in December of that same year, and would return to his banking job in Manhattan. In 1929, his wife was called up for the duty of christening the new battle cruiser, which was named after her hometown. Naturally, she would leading her own entourage made up of 23 guests from Pensacola, who were there to witness the gala event. Luckily, she and her husband were living in Manhattan on 5th Avenue, so they didn't have far to travel to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Navy public relations personnel were provided to walk her through her duties so that everything would go smoothly. In addition to the commanding officers of every naval department and political appointee that you could imagine, there was also several special people from Pensacola that were noted. There was Almuth W. Decker, who was there to stand in for Pensacola's Mayor Harvey Bayless. Almuth was the plant supervisor for the Bruce Dry Dock Works in Pensacola. There was also Mrs. Mary Elizabeth Merritt Davis, whose husband was the famous naval flyer Lieutenant Commander Noel Guy Davis. On April 26, 1927, he and Lieutenant Stanton Hall Worcester were killed attempting to beat Charles Lindbergh as the first solo pilot to cross the Atlantic. Back home, he is buried in the St. John's Cemetery. Knowles' wife was the daughter of a shipbroker, John Abercrombie Merritt, another king of commerce, and Mary Rosa Turner. Also in her entourage was U.S. naval aviator Ralph Eugene Davison. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy in the class of 1916. He would enter the Navy's flight school in Pensacola, Florida, in September 1919 and complete his training in March 1920. He would leave Pensacola with a shiny set of gold wings and a Pensacola girl, Miss Elizabeth Dunham, on his arm as his new bride. Long after the christening of the USS Pensacola, Davison became a task group commander during the Battle of Leyte Gulf and again during the Battle of Iwo Jima. In 1946, Admiral Chester Nimitz asked Davison to select the first officer to command the new Naval Flight Demonstration Squadron. In this capacity, he chose Lieutenant Commander Butch Voris to lead the Navy's famous Blue Angels. Davison would retire in 1948 with the rank of Vice Admiral. He and Elizabeth retired to her hometown of Pensacola, where they planned on living out their well-earned lives. But sadly, that was not to be. On December 2, 1971, he and Elizabeth were watching television at their home at 1725 North Barcelona Street when they saw smoke coming from the rear of the house. The fire spread quickly, trapping Elizabeth inside. She was rushed to the hospital where she died of smoke inhalation. In the meantime, Josie's ceremony was set and ready to go. She wrote her father back home, "We breakfasted at 7:45 and pulled out at 8:45 a.m. with our police escort. There were 5 large motor cars in our group, with my gardener Charles in the station wagon in the rear with my Pensacola servants with him. Charles was wild-eyed as they tried to keep pace with the motorcycle cops. In fact, Stevenson, my chauffeur, was almost run over because no one thought he was part of the procession. We arrived at the Admiral's house 5 minutes late, where I was introduced to Charles Francis Adams III, the Secretary of the Navy. We were then rushed off to the platform, located below the Admiral's quarters, but still 40 feet above the ground. When you looked up, we could see the Pensacola's anchors far above us. Josie and each of the ladies were handed beautiful bouquets, with hers being comprised of American beauties and ribbons that matched her dress. The Pensacola girls all had different bouquets with separate color combinations for each. At 10:15 a.m., Admiral Louis de Steiger called for the bugler to call the ship's crew to attention. He had been told the ship was pulling hard, so they needed to get going. This was the cue for the presentation of the chaplain's prayers. Down below them, Josie could hear the hammers of the workers banging to knock the supports loose. Then Josie stated that she was handed the champagne bottle filled with spring water and told to get ready because the ship may start sliding at any moment. She took the bottle and swung it back just to see how much room she could take, because she had to strike hard to overcome the silk cord wrapping around it. During her practice swing, she barely missed the nose of the Secretary of the Navy by only half an inch. Suddenly, the Pensacola began to slide, but Josie was ready with a gigantic swing that shattered the bottle into a million pieces. She was left with only the bottle's neck in her hand, and a memory that would last a lifetime. Afterwards, and with absolutely no warning, she heard, "Mrs. Seligman, your speech will follow that of the Admiral." From that point on, I never heard a word of what he said. When the microphone was finally stuck in my face, my knees were shaking so bad, and my stomach was turning upside down. However, My husband Joseph was very proud of me, and they all said I did fine. After this milestone in Josie's life, she returned to her world of influence and privilege. When the stock market crashed in 1929, those banks that were guilty of too many defaulting loans or bad stock investments were forced out of business. Exactly what impact on Josie and her banking husband is unknown, however her father had been well diversified in his business dealings and investments. Then came World War II and Joseph chose to return to military service, but this time with the U.S. Navy in Pensacola. Then in March 1944, Joseph was given a medical discharge from the Navy because of bad health. On April 8, 1944, he was found dead by Josie in their bathroom at their home in Bayshore. The headline reported that his body was being returned to New York, but he appears to have been buried with Josie at Buranka Cemetery. Josie would pass away on October 28, 1985, whereas her beloved ship would survive 2 atomic blasts in July 1948. Afterwards, the USS Pensacola was used for target practice later that same year before she quietly slipped beneath the waves forevermore.